Jesus's actual gospel, the lost gospel of Jesus, was called the way of the law.
Isus means hail Zeus. So you're calling on Zeus when you say Jesus.
Thomas, in the first century, it must have come earlier than the Gospel of John.
Jesus taught reincarnation and meditation. The more we read the Emerald Tablets, we realize readily that the connection between Thoth and Jesus is there.
Within the Venn diagram of Aaron Abke and Billy Carson, is there a central piece to that?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things going on. I think if there is a connective thread between the Billy Carsons and the Aaron Abkes of the world, it's this a skepticism of organized religion and an advocacy for not necessarily new age, but new thought. And there's a division there that's not always as evident as people think. My friend Melissa Doherty wrote a great book, Happy Lies, where she talks about what the differences in that really are. But if you look at the parallels in that Venn diagram of Billy and Aaron, they both advocate a lot for things like manifestation or Christ consciousness. And I think what that entails is a complete rereading of the traditional perspectives on the Bible. So it's a little bit of, I take the things I want, but I leave out other things. Fundamentally, there's an inconsistency in, you cannot be consistent with things like your hermeneutic and your exegesis throughout all of those, because you have to advocate for certain aspects of the Jesus in the Gospels being reliable, because that's where you're pulling some of your data from, and others being not reliable. But the methodology by which you discern the reliability and the unreliability of, say, one verse of Jesus talking and the verse immediately after of Jesus talking is subjective. It's really a case of confirmation bias. And this is a problem I think a lot of my Muslim friends have as well, is that they'll advocate for certain texts within the New Testament to validate their positions with Islam. But then in the same book, chapter, pericope, verse, they will dismiss other things that are in the immediate context because it doesn't agree with them. And the methodology by which you are saying this is true and this is not evident, other than, with the Muslim, it's what agrees with the Quran, what comes 600 years after. If it agrees with that, then it's true, and if it doesn't, then it's not. And there's sort of an anachronistic reading back on that type of hermeneutic. And with a kind of Christ consciousness perspective, you really have to ignore either the plain reading of the text or an actual exegetical perspective of the text in order to derive this mystical, we are all God, you can attain divinity by Christ consciousness, and you have the human Jesus and the divine Christ, but we all could be Christ. These kind of threads intersect with those individuals. There's also, the notoriety of something unusual, the conspiratorial aspect of it's either the Vatican or the Roman Catholic Church, or someone's trying to hide this stuff from us. This is the whole, onus behind phrases like lost gospels. Well, the quote-unquote lost gospels were never really lost. We've known about them the whole time. If only in name. The Gospel of Peter we've known about since the bishop of in the second century, Serapion of Antioch, was written to by the church in Syria, and they said, hey, there's this document. It's called the Gospel of Peter. Should we read it? And we have this correspondence back and forth. And so even though we didn't find the Gospel of Peter in the physical documentation until until like the mid 20th century, we still understood that there was this document, and we actually knew some of its content based on the communication between these early Christians. So when we discovered the Gospel of Peter, what did it do? It just confirmed that Serapion and the church that he was communicating with, the document that Serapion condemned as being docetic and gnostic, when we actually found the document and read it in its original language, guess what? It was docetic and gnostic. So the term lost in a lot of these things is a misnomer, but it gives this air of secrecy, and that certain people, they know they're in the club about the secrets, and they can let you in on the secret as well.
Yeah, there is such a draw to esoteric knowledge across the board, and so here's my question though, because this is one thing I noticed when talking with Alex, but that I think is reflective of the way that a lot of people think in this cultural moment, which is to be as severely critical of the 66 books of the Bible, or but to be very open and curious about anything outside of those, if that makes sense. So, I mean, honestly, the word for word versus 99% word for word is a perfect example of this idea where it's like, oh, wait a second, fact check. Like, and it's really kind of this like desire to want to dismiss, do away with, prove wrong or something. But then if it's like, hey, wait a second, there's this other thing over here, the gospel according to fill in the blank, that I guess my question is this, is if it's not actually if it's later in history, if it doesn't have as many copies, if it's not as actually historically reliable, if it wasn't accepted by the early church, if it's not included as part of the canon, why is it so appealing is basically my question. And why is the same standard of scrutiny not applied symmetrically in both scenarios? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And I don't know if I can get into the brains of everybody.
Fair.
Who's kind of like imposing motivations on them.
Fair.
But I think people do. I mean, I found this in my own graduate studies when I knew an individual who was studying classics, and he was doing some text critical work on Xenophon. And he was talking to me about the fact that he's like, man, we have so much less evidence textually for Xenophon than we do, than you guys do for the New Testament. And we kind of just give the benefit of the doubt to the text when we're kind of interpolating some of the missing text, or when we're comparing, because Xenophon wrote a biography of Socrates. And so it was Xenophon, Aristophanes, and Plato all wrote biographical material on Socrates, and there are differences between those, and they use methods like harmonization to come up with the end discussion of what Socrates was like. And he's like, man, when I look at what the kind of similar secular scholars that are in my field are, the way they're talking about harmonization, and then I look at secular scholars within New Testament studies, there's a revulsion against the term harmonization in New Testament studies. He's like, but in classics, it's not a dirty word. We use it all the time, because you just give the level of just the benefit of the doubt to the text, given the data that you have. Your inference to the best explanation assumes that not that they're wrong and you need to prove them right, but that they're right, and then you find certain things that don't add up. And so I think that happens sometimes when we're talking about these other things. I think it also, because there's a religion tied to these 27 historical documents that we call the New Testament, and there are people that hold dogmatically, and I think dogmatically in the good sense, not dogmatically in the wrong sense, in terms of their theological perspectives, then people often have more of kind of a debunking attitude towards that than I think may often be necessary. But you're right. I was talking to someone about this in regards to the Proto-Evangelion of James, which is this document from the 2nd century that has this birth narrative of Mary, and it's one of the main reasons why we get the perpetual virginity of Mary is kind of developed in this community that wrote down documents like the Proto-Evangelion of James. And there's all sorts of issues with the Proto-Evangelion of James in terms of the timing and the description of Mary. Even there's, the age of Mary and the age of Joseph. Like, all of this stuff is historically problematic. But this person was trying to advocate that, this is something that we should look at reliably. And I was just trying to help them see, well, if we look at the internal ways that we verify the reliability of a document, I'm going to stick with Matthew and Luke way before I'm going to go to the Proto-Evangelion of James, because Matthew and Luke show themselves to be true and show themselves to be reliable and show themselves to be transparent far more than something like the Proto-Evangelion of James, which appears to have motivations to insert other ideas that are popping up in the century after the time of Jesus. But I think people look at the notoriety and they look at the sensationalism, and people are attracted to the sensationalism. And if you want to find sensationalism, the apocryphal material is chock full of that.
Mm-hmm. Can you unpack what you were just talking about a little bit, just for myself and the listener, to what those specific determining factors are that you're talking about that make Matthew higher quality in terms of its reliability? And I guess, can I ask a sub question? Like, is that what the people who played the role of canonization were looking at? Like, what were the metrics that people were looking at to go, okay, this qualifies, this doesn't?
Part and parcel to the discussion of the canonization within the reliability of the Gospels in particular, but the New Testament as a whole, was that the early church was looking at the plethora of Christian writings that existed, and the ultimate delineation came down to, can we tie this to someone who knew Jesus or someone who knew Jesus? And that was really the criteria. It's called apostolicity, where they said, okay, can we tie this to an apostle or kind of a connection to an apostle? And there were actually documents that we don't think of as heretical, like First Clement, the Shepherd of Hermes, the Epistle of Barnabas, that were widely popular, that were used within the edification of the reading of the church. And yet, when they looked at the kind of chain of custody of going back to the apostles, they said, we can't reliably trace this within the earliest Jesus community. And so even though it's something we read, even though it's something that's useful, this does not have the authority and the bearing of what we would consider inspired scripture. And so there is some of that in terms of kind of doing the due diligence of the internal reliability. But I mean, when we come to gospel writings, we're fortunate that we have, as I said before, they're chock full of helpful detail and juicy tidbits regarding the stories of Jesus. So for example, when sifting through the particulars of a recorded event, either ancient or modern, we can apply this today, we should continually be asking ourselves, does the author show familiarity with the times and the places that they claim to be describing and writing about? So the details regarding the who, the what, the where, and the when can give away the reliability or, on the flip side, the unreliability of a recorded event. So unlike modern times, where information concerning things like geography and cultural landmarks and agriculture are just at our fingertips, right? It's one click away. I can go to Wikipedia and I can find the information I want. Mm-hmm. Discovering and recording the information during the time of Jesus could only accurately be done by an individual who was either there at these locations in the claimed time frame, or at minimum connected with someone else who had. So these often amount to details that we as modern readers tend to skip over and don't fully recognize. But the reality is that the familiarity with the times and the places they're talking about gives away a lot of information. So let me just give you a quick example of this. Mm-hmm. The geography in the Gospels, for example, speaks volumes about the accuracy of the recorded events. So all four Gospels specifically mention trips going up to Jerusalem, which reveals the authenticity, if for no other reason, than Jerusalem has an elevation of 750 meters above sea level. And therefore, traveling to Jerusalem would have actually been a trip upwards. And actually, Mark and Luke mention leaving Jerusalem, and they correctly describe it as going down. This is not just, these aren't throwaway comments. And even more on point, Jesus' use of typography in the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10 starts by saying that a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and that the priest was going down the road. And this is significant because Jericho is the lowest city on earth. It's over 250 meters below sea level. And so going from Jerusalem to Jericho involves a descent of a whole kilometer. I don't know what that is in miles. I'm a Canadian, and we use the distances that you guys don't use. So, but it's a whole kilometer descent. So to describe this trip as going down is more than just a use of expression by Jesus. It's actually factually accurate. And the story also assumes Jesus' audience is aware of a direct route from Jerusalem to Jericho, which is exactly what we find in the archaeological record from this time and would have been well known in the route to the locals in Jesus' immediate audience. So these are just like small tidbits, right? It's an inconsequential thing. We don't even think about the use of the verbiage, going up to Jerusalem, going down to Jericho. But it's things like that, or, in the Can I Trust the Bible series that I played a clip of in the Joe Rogan Experience episode, I played a clip from the first episode of that series that I produced, where we talked about onomastic congruence with the name correlation. What we see in the Bible is the names that we should see. And also, let me note that with these type of like geographical or onomastic, these name things, a lot of the other gospels, the ones that we were talking about before, the gospel of, insert Thomas, Judas, Mary, they lack these details. So the gospel of Thomas, for example, names Judea once with no other place names given. And then the gospel of Judas and the gospel of Mary have no name locations. And the gospel of Philip does name Jerusalem 4 times, along with Nazareth and the Jordan, but that's hardly noteworthy. Jerusalem was already a very well-known geographical location in the 2nd century when the Gospel of Philip is thought to have been written. And Nazareth became famous as the home of Jesus, and the Jordan was the main river in the area. So none of those descriptions give any type of substantial, noteworthy familiarity with the places that Jesus lived and taught at or visited during his earthly ministry. And yet, when we have the biblical Gospels, we find that we have a plethora of geographical data, and that doesn't just talk about the distances between places. It talks about geography more broadly. It talks about fauna and flora that we can correlate. Jewish colloquialisms of botanical descriptions and the usage of examples of proper financial transactional practices of the specific areas in question are found throughout the Gospels. And so these are these like internal methodological things that we look for as historians. I'm going to look for those in Aristophanes. I'm going to look for those in Tacitus. I'm going to look for those in Josephus. And I'm going to look for them in the Gospels. And we find them in the Gospels.
If you like these kind of videos but aren't subscribed, help us reach that 1 million milestone. It also helps other people see this type of content in the future. I'll leave a link in the description where you can watch a documentary that I made. It's got Nabil Qureshi, Lee Strobel, William Lane Craig, and a bunch of other people in there that answer a lot of the questions that I've had about God over the years. I think you'll really like it, and it's totally free.